She thought I'd cook her dinner while she plotted to ruin my life. What she didn't know was that every word, every lie, every betrayal, I already knew. And I was waiting. The late afternoon sunlight filtered through the high-rise windows of a sleek downtown penthouse, casting golden reflections across polished marble countertops and stainless steel appliances. Lawrence Sullivan stood at the kitchen island, his sharp movements steady and controlled as he diced vegetables for dinner. Cooking had always offered him a momentary break from the relentless demands of his life as CEO of Sullivan Properties, one of the city's most dominant real estate development firms. At 43, Lawrence had the presence of a man accustomed to power. Tall, composed, with eyes that missed nothing and a mind that rarely slept. Every deal he'd made had been calculated, every risk weighed, and tonight, like every night before it, he turned to cooking not for necessity, but for control, a quiet ritual in a world of noise. He had just adjusted the heat on the pan where a carefully crusted piece of salmon was sizzling when the sound of heels echoed down the hallway. Patricia, his wife of nearly 15 years, entered the kitchen wearing a black designer dress that clung to her like static. He didn't recognize the dress or the scent. The perfume was expensive, bold, and completely unfamiliar. Patricia didn't offer a greeting. She barely acknowledged the man preparing her dinner. Instead, she checked her reflection in the glossy surface of the microwave, applying another coat of lipstick with meticulous flair. Lawrence watched her silently. He had learned long ago that the most dangerous words were spoken when one was already convinced they were untouchable. Without looking at him, she tossed her hair over her shoulder and announced she had plans that evening. She was going out, not with friends, not for business, but with someone else. Someone she called exciting. Someone named Herman. Lawrence didn't react. He placed the knife gently beside the cutting board. Years of restraint, of self-discipline, of watching and waiting, they did not fail him now. She called him dull, predictable, claimed Herman had shown her what life could feel like again. Lawrence listened as she made her exit with all the theatrics of someone convinced she held the upper hand. The sound of her heels was sharp and deliberate. Her laughter echoed as she disappeared out the door. Moments later, Teresa Delgado, the longtime housekeeper, stepped into the doorway, having clearly heard more than she was meant to. Lawrence met her eyes and spoke calmly, instructing her to take the rest of the day off with full pay. No further explanation was needed. She understood. She always had. When the apartment fell silent again, Lawrence turned off the stove. The salmon, though perfectly cooked, no longer held his attention. He sat at the table alone and pulled out his phone. The contact he selected was not new, nor was it one he'd ever expected to use. But the time had come. The call was answered after 2 rings. On the other end, a familiar voice responded with professionalism. "Begin execution," Lawrence said quietly. "Plan Echo." Felix Rourke, the head of Sullivan's personal security and logistics team, confirmed without hesitation. Files would be delivered. Accounts would be handled. Precautions already in place would be activated. Jasmine Chin, the private investigator hired months earlier, had already begun final documentation. Lawrence ended the call, returned to the kitchen, and plated the salmon with his usual precision. The vegetables remained half-prepared on the cutting board. That no longer mattered. What mattered was that every moment, every insult, every betrayal, had been carefully documented. The surveillance cameras he had installed after Patricia's habits began shifting had captured everything. In a quiet, climate-controlled room adjacent to his office, digital backups were being uploaded. Files named, cross-referenced, encrypted. Patricia hadn't just broken his trust. She had activated a response system designed by a man who never left anything to chance. Across the city, in a restaurant filled with low lighting and high ceilings, Patricia laughed over a glass of champagne. Herman McKay, dressed with all the arrogance of a man who overestimated his charm and underestimated his debt, leaned in close as they toasted to what they believed would be a new beginning. Neither of them noticed the woman at the bar with her phone discreetly positioned. Jasmine Chin had trailed them for weeks, documenting every secret dinner, every exchanged word, every damning phrase. As Patricia lifted her glass, Jasmine captured another image and sent it to Lawrence. Her message was brief. Target confirmed. Recording live. Back in the penthouse, Lawrence finished his meal in silence, chewing each bite with methodical calm. His phone buzzed, one alert after another. Elijah Boone, his attorney, had received the compiled evidence. Jasmine's final surveillance package was uploading. Felix was initiating the financial contingency steps, offshore accounts, asset protection, legal triggers. The first move was complete. The betrayal had been acknowledged. But the game had only just begun. And as the city's lights flickered to life outside his window, Lawrence Sullivan sat in his penthouse, not as a victim, but as a strategist watching his carefully placed pieces begin to move across a board no one else had realized existed. Lawrence Sullivan had never believed in reacting without preparation. While some fought battles in the heat of emotion, he preferred the cold advantage of planning. So when Patricia walked out of their penthouse that night, unaware that she had triggered a well-calibrated system, she also unknowingly surrendered any control she thought she had. From his home office, Lawrence monitored his private surveillance network, the one Patricia didn't know existed. It displayed crystal-clear footage of her departure, her tone, her choice of words. Jasmine Chin had also uploaded an audio recording from the restaurant where Patricia now dined with Herman McKay. The combination of live feeds and external surveillance allowed Lawrence to coordinate with the kind of precision he had once reserved only for major real estate negotiations. He reviewed files labeled with timestamps, each one linked to documented instances of suspicious behavior. This wasn't paranoia. This was insurance. For the last 3 months, Jasmine had compiled a timeline of Patricia's meetings, financial activities, and communications. What she discovered was worse than he had anticipated. The affair had begun 6 months ago. At first, it was discreet. A few calls, long lunches masked as shopping trips. Then came the hotel reservations, the private flights listed under pseudonyms, the gifts purchased using funds from shared accounts. Lawrence hadn't confronted her. He'd let it unfold, allowed her to believe he was too distracted by quarterly reports and international expansion to notice. She had no idea her phone had been mirrored weeks ago. Her conversations, stored. Her chats with Herman, including the messages about pushing Lawrence over the edge, saved and dated. Her plans to reroute assets to access accounts he'd already locked, all captured in digital snapshots. Felix Rourke's team was already implementing Phase 2. Bank accounts had been frozen or redirected. Credit cards assigned to Patricia had been canceled without warning. Her name had been removed from corporate privileges, property deeds, insurance policies. All assets associated with her identity were now inaccessible. The legal division, led by Elijah Boone, had ensured everything complied with both local and international law. Meanwhile, Patricia continued her evening as though nothing had changed. She toasted to her new life, unaware that the financial platform she relied upon had vanished. Herman McKay, seated across from her, spoke with exaggerated confidence about taking over parts of Sullivan Properties. He didn't know that his firm was already under investigation for internal inconsistencies and unreported debts. Details Jasmine had uncovered and forwarded to Lawrence's legal team. Back in the penthouse, Lawrence sat before a wall of monitors, sipping tea rather than alcohol. He found clarity in sobriety, in observing every move his opponents made. Jasmine's next message appeared. Confirmed. Subject discussing access to joint accounts tomorrow. He nodded to himself, mentally noting the timeline. They believed he was unaware. They still thought they held the advantage. That assumption would be their undoing. In another part of the city, Patricia laughed loudly, completely at ease. She had no idea that Jasmine was seated just a few feet away, her discreet microphone capturing every word. The recording would be included in the final evidence packet, one destined not only for court but for key figures in their shared circles. Back at the Sullivan residence, Teresa Delgado returned briefly to retrieve her belongings. Lawrence thanked her for her service, handing her a sealed envelope containing a month's pay in advance. She asked no questions, only expressed gratitude and quiet concern. She, too, had witnessed the slow unraveling of the household, And unlike Patricia, she had never confused kindness for weakness. By midnight, Lawrence had received confirmation that his contingency network was fully activated. Property titles had been transferred to private entities. Shell corporations now held majority shares in his assets. Retirement funds, trusts, and business accounts had been moved offshore. Patricia might try to access them in the morning, but she would find nothing familiar, nothing accessible. As the clock ticked past 2 a.m., Elijah Boone's encrypted message came through. All legal filings prepared, evidence organized, ready to proceed at your signal. Lawrence typed a single word. Now. It was the culmination of months of quiet preparation. While Patricia and Herman chased adrenaline and secrets, Lawrence had been building a new foundation beneath their feet, one they could neither see nor sabotage. In her mind, Patricia believed she had chosen freedom. In truth, she had chosen exposure. And soon, the world would see exactly who she was. Not through Lawrence's words, but through her own actions, recorded, time-stamped, and undeniable. The first phase was complete. The second had begun. And the storm Patricia Sterling had created was about to return home, restructured, rebranded, and irreversible. At dawn, the penthouse stood in silence, stripped of its former warmth. The furniture remained where it had always been, but something fundamental had shifted. Lawrence Sullivan watched from his home office as the final reports arrived in sequence, each one confirming that his countermeasures had been enacted to perfection. The digital dashboard on his screen reflected a world in motion. Offshore transfers complete, legal notifications sent, access revoked. He had built his empire brick by brick, and now he was disassembling the life he shared with Patricia just as precisely. Outside, the city began to stir. Inside, Patricia was about to wake up to a different reality. By 8 a.m., a courier arrived at a quiet suburban estate, the home of Patricia's mother, Clara Vaughn. She had always been distant with Lawrence, critical of his calm demeanor and steady ways. She had preferred the excitement that Patricia found in chaos. But this morning, Clara answered the door in her robe and was handed a sealed envelope by a man in a suit. She called her daughter down without opening it. Patricia descended the staircase slowly, wearing the same dress from the night before, now creased and faded. She took the envelope with visible irritation until she read the first page. The words petition for dissolution of marriage stared back at her, framed by dozens of legal attachments, documents, and photographs. Her expression changed from boredom to disbelief, then horror. Inside the envelope were time-stamped images, photographs of her and Herman McKay together in hotels, private lounges, and even inside the Sullivan penthouse. Bank statements followed, tracing irregular transactions and fund withdrawals from joint accounts. Patricia's voice broke into a furious shriek as she realized the depth of the surveillance. She grabbed her phone and dialed Herman. No answer. She tried again. Still nothing. Across town, Herman was facing a reckoning of his own. His wife, Margot Lane, stood in their kitchen, a manila envelope open on the counter beside her. Her expression was unreadable as she reviewed the documents Lawrence had ensured were hand-delivered to her. They contained evidence of Herman's infidelity and attempts at financial fraud. She asked him one question, just one. How long? Herman stuttered, offered half excuses, claimed ignorance, denial. Margot didn't raise her voice. She pointed to the door and informed him that her attorney would handle the rest. The calls from Patricia continued. He silenced them all. Back in the city, Patricia stormed into their private bank, attempting to withdraw funds. The manager remained professional as he informed her that her access had been frozen. Every account tied to Lawrence had been flagged due to suspected fraudulent activity. Her credit cards were suspended. Her name removed from corporate accounts. When she demanded explanations, the response was clear. Everything was in accordance with legal procedure, and she was advised to consult her attorney. She left the building shaken, humiliated, her exit far from the confident walkout she had envisioned just days earlier. At that very hour, Lawrence convened in a discreet conference room inside a high-security hotel. He was joined by Elijah Boone, who reviewed each of the active motions, divorce filings, fraud documentation, financial disclosures. Every step had been anticipated, every formality completed. Jasmine Chin sat nearby, adding new surveillance evidence to the master archive, including audio of Patricia and Herman casually discussing Lawrence's death as a convenient outcome. The gravity of it didn't shock Lawrence. He had heard the recordings already, countless times. The tone in their voices, the careless cruelty. It had long since moved past heartbreak and into resolve. Felix Rourke's update came in as the meeting closed. Security footage had been archived, lock changes completed, and all remaining personal effects packed. Lawrence had authorized the sale of the penthouse earlier that morning. The legal transfer would be finalized before sunset. The apartment where Patricia had once played queen was no longer hers to enter. At midday, moving trucks arrived. New owners were scheduled to begin the transition the following morning. When Patricia returned to the building, expecting confrontation, she found strangers carrying out the last of the furniture. A man in a dark blazer offering her legal paperwork confirming the change of ownership. Her outrage dissolved into disbelief. She was told she could retrieve her boxed belongings from the garage before 5 p.m. No one yelled. No one needed to. The plan had been too seamless, too thorough. There was no room for arguments, no openings for negotiation. In the garage, Patricia found her life reduced to neatly labeled boxes. Handbags, heels, expensive perfumes. She opened one, pulled out a velvet dress, and sat on the cold floor beside it, dialing the only person who might understand. Her mother. But Clara Vaughn didn't answer. Not immediately. When she finally picked up, she didn't offer sympathy. "You brought this on yourself," she said. "I raised you better." The call ended in silence. By the time the sun dipped behind the city skyline, Patricia had moved her boxes into a storage unit, paid for with her mother's credit card. Her old life, once adorned with designer labels and weekend galas, now existed only in cardboard and memory. And Lawrence Sullivan? He didn't celebrate. He didn't gloat. He simply stood in the window of his temporary suite, watching the skyline as the final stage of the dismantling unfolded. His expression was calm, just as it had been the night everything started. By morning, the storm had passed. Not the kind that battered windows or soaked streets, but one that changed the course of lives, silently and permanently. Lawrence Sullivan stood before a floor-to-ceiling window of his temporary suite at a luxury hotel, sipping black coffee as the city stretched awake beneath him. He looked calm, composed, and focused, as if this day were no different from any other. But everything was different now. The penthouse had officially changed ownership. The contracts signed at dawn transferred all rights to a private buyer operating through an offshore trust. Lawrence didn't need to know who they were, only that the property no longer tied him to a life he'd already walked away from. Felix Rourke, always efficient, had ensured every trace of Lawrence's residency was gone. Surveillance systems had been removed or wiped clean. Teresa Delgado's final paycheck had been wired along with a letter of reference for her new venture. Her loyalty had not gone unnoticed. Meanwhile, Patricia Sterling wandered through the modest hotel room she'd checked into the night before. The space, though clean and modern, felt foreign to her, cold, impersonal, a far cry from the curated elegance she once demanded. Her belongings, the boxes labeled by strangers, sat piled near the wall untouched. Her attempts to call Herman McKay had gone unanswered. The last time she'd heard his voice, it had been curt, dismissive. The man who had once promised her a life of excitement and luxury now avoided her with every ounce of energy he had left. Unbeknownst to her, Herman faced his own collapse. Margot Lane had exposed him to the very circles that once embraced his charm. Business deals dried up overnight. The investigation into his financial misconduct spread quietly but efficiently. His name had become synonymous with scandal, and his former allies were now closing their doors one after another. Lawrence received Jasmine Chin's latest surveillance update shortly after lunch. It confirmed Herman's removal from several advisory boards and that his real estate firm had quietly shut its doors. His name had been stripped from websites, brochures, even property signage. A man once obsessed with status was now losing his identity, piece by piece. Elijah Boone joined Lawrence in the hotel's private lounge to review final divorce proceedings. The judge, appalled by the compiled evidence, had accelerated the case. With adultery, fraud, and financial misconduct confirmed, Patricia's claims had been rejected without hearing.
No assets. No compensation.
No appeals. What once might have taken months had resolved in days, because Lawrence had prepared for it like he prepared for everything. Across the city, Patricia stared at her phone in disbelief. Message after message arrived from former friends, each one colder than the last. Some expressed shock at what they'd seen. Others offered nothing at all. Jasmine's dossier had made its way into the hands of influencers, executives, and press figures. The recordings, the receipts, the photos, they left no room for interpretation. The woman who once commanded rooms with her presence now found herself shut out from them entirely. By late afternoon, Patricia returned to her mother's house, humiliated and exhausted. Clara Vaughn watched her daughter walk through the door in silence. She offered no hug, no words of comfort, only a simple question, "Have you eaten?" Patricia didn't answer. She climbed the stairs slowly and closed herself inside her childhood room. A space filled with pastel walls, old photos, and the remnants of a version of herself that no longer existed. That evening, Lawrence finalized the final stage of his own disappearance. His assistant in Singapore confirmed the opening of a new entity under a different name. A new life was already forming across continents. He wouldn't return to this city. He didn't need to. The chapter was closed. At midnight, Jasmine's final report arrived. All targets neutralized. All relevant parties informed. No loose ends. Lawrence read through it with quiet precision, then closed the file. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to breathe. The world Patricia tried to create had collapsed under the weight of its own deception. What she called excitement was nothing more than recklessness. What she labeled predictable was strategic. What she once laughed at was now the reason she had nothing left. And Lawrence Sullivan, the man she tried to break, had already begun again. Not with rage, but with silence. The past was behind him, and his future belonged only to him. 5 years had passed, and the city had changed, as cities always do. New towers pierced the skyline, businesses came and went, and people moved on, often unaware of the shadows left behind by stories no longer spoken aloud. In a quiet corner of the Sunrise Plaza Hotel, a woman in a faded uniform arranged pastries in the lobby's continental breakfast station. Her hands, once adorned with diamond rings, now bore signs of age and labor. Red, dry, practical. Her name tag read Patricia. The elegant curves of her signature now reduced to block print. Patricia Sterling, formerly the wife of Lawrence Sullivan, had long since lost the penthouse, the social invitations, the friends who once clung to her like perfume. She now lived in a modest guest house behind her mother's property, commuting by bus, packing lunches in plastic containers, and smiling politely at strangers who would never know who she used to be. No one at the hotel recognized her last name, and that was how it had to be. Across town, Herman McKay shuffled through spreadsheets in a drab office lined with filing cabinets. The once confident developer was now an operations supervisor at his brother-in-law's supply firm. The tailored suits had been replaced by off-the-rack dress shirts. His office had no door, only a glass divider. The man who once boasted about taking over Sullivan Properties now reviewed purchase orders under constant supervision. His reconciliation with Margot Lane had come at a cost. Mandatory therapy, complete financial transparency, and a postnuptial agreement that kept him leashed. He smiled when necessary, nodded on cue, and lived with the understanding that his past would never stop haunting his present. At a different pace, in a distant part of the world, Lawrence Sullivan stood on the balcony of his private villa, overlooking an emerald shoreline. His hair was grayer now, but his eyes remained sharp. The estate, hidden behind corporate entities and trusts, served as both sanctuary and control center. From here, Lawrence managed the international network of holdings that replaced his old empire. Quietly, efficiently, without a trace, reports arrived via secure channels. Businesses thrived in his absence. His philanthropic work, anonymously funded, had rebuilt schools, hospitals, and housing initiatives across multiple countries. No one knew where the money came from, and no one asked. Lawrence no longer needed to prove anything. His assistant, Samantha Bailey, brought him a tablet displaying recent updates. Patricia had lost her last apartment after failing to keep up with payments. Herman had been rejected from yet another investor pitch. Their reputations, long since destroyed, ensured their options remained limited. He read the updates without emotion. They weren't a source of joy or bitterness, merely consequences playing themselves out. Back in the city, Patricia received another envelope, this one anonymous. Inside, a flash drive and a note. "You should never have underestimated him." She inserted the drive into her aging laptop, and the screen filled with familiar footage. There she was, 5 years younger, sitting across from Herman in the penthouse kitchen, laughing at Lawrence, mocking his routines, plotting how to gain access to the company's accounts. She had forgotten the camera, forgotten her own voice. At the end of the video, a single clip played, Lawrence speaking directly to the lens. Calm. Measured. "You confused patience with weakness. What you mistook for silence was strategy. Now, everything you tried to take is gone, and so am I." Patricia closed the laptop, heart pounding. The weight of what she had done, and lost, pressed down on her chest like a stone. There were no more explanations, no more chances, only routine, only reminders. She placed the flash drive back into its case, tucked it into a drawer, and tied her hair back before returning to her shift. In a nearby cafe, Jasmine Chin stirred her coffee while scanning headlines. One article mentioned the explosive success of a new logistics firm operating out of Asia, its parent company unknown. She smiled faintly. The style, the structure, the strategic growth, all unmistakably Sullivan. And somewhere across oceans, Lawrence stood at the edge of his villa as the sun disappeared beyond the horizon. He wasn't running. He hadn't vanished out of fear. He had simply evolved, shedding everything unnecessary and walking away with everything that mattered. The revenge hadn't been loud. It hadn't come in dramatic scenes or violent confrontations. It had come in silence, in planning, in patience, and in the end, that had been more devastating than any outburst. Because the real punishment was never what he did to them. It was what they did to themselves, with just enough rope and no one left to blame.